Thank you for being here to watch Ryan's presentation today. If you can make sure that your mics are muted so that we don't disrupt his presentation, and then when we get to the question and answer section, please enter your questions for Ryan in the chat column. Ryan, I will turn it over to you at this point. Good luck.
All right, thank you, Mr. Anderson. Death, the destroyer of worlds. Death awaits us all, whether by old age, violence, or sickness. Yet this death that lies in store for each of us is not an evil. Rather, death is just another path, one that we must all take. In fact, it is death that gives meaning to our life, for it is in death that we find a limit to our time in this world, a limit to our time to be good and lead good lives. Accordingly, it falls incumbent on us to seek to live the good life with the time allotted to us. But how does a person seek the good life? Where does he start? For me, the answer has grown apparent over the last few years. The first time I considered the good life in earnest was towards the end of my 8th grade year. I had, of course, heard of the dreaded senior thesis. Back then, it was merely a shadow on the horizon. However, as I began to devote more attention to the literature that we read, I realized a deep sense of harmony between myself and the books. Mantei's struggle against a hedonistic society, Atticus's resolve and integrity, these paragons seemed to resound within me. To make a long story short, after realizing that my innermost ideals were reflected in the stories I was dealing with at school, I began to search for these ideals elsewhere. My search took me from music, such as Victor Hugo's Les Mis, to films like Lord of the Rings, to books, including Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. However, it was ultimately in my family, both my adoptive family and the family composed of my good friends, that I was able to witness in the flesh those ideals that the stories were only able to whisper in my ears. Thus, it is from their examples that I was able to draw my conclusion of what the good life consists. The good life consists in 3 aspects of pietas: an internal aspect, self-reliance, an external aspect, open-mindedness, and an overarching thematic aspect, the guiding purpose. To begin to explain this thesis, I will define pietas, first in the ancient sense of the word, and then in a modern interpretation. Then, I will discuss the concept of self-reliance. After that, I will describe the open mindset as the external aspect of pietas that builds upon the foundation of self-reliance. Finally, I will discuss what I mean by a guiding purpose and show how self-reliance and the open mindset must be synchronized with such a purpose for a person to live the good life. Pietas is an old Latin term for the king of all classical virtues. However, pietas is a term unwieldy to translate, for instead of a simple 1 or 2 word meaning, pietas connotes an attitude that encompasses the fundamental aspects of a person's life. W.R. Johnson describes, pietas connotes a kind of spiritual integrity that is grounded in the individual's sure recognition of his place in the order of things, and learning his responsibilities to his family, his city, his gods, to all humankind. The individual learns something also of the eternal, universal truths that govern all reality. In meeting his responsibilities, and so revering the mysterious truths that shape his existence, the individual learns to know and honor himself, understands the value of his life, and therein finds both his identity and happiness. Like all virtues, pietas is ultimately a quality of the soul. In particular, pietas is a quality of integrity that arises from a person's sure recognition of his place in the order of things. Integrity here has a dual meaning. On the one hand, pietas connotes the cohesion and completeness of the soul. On the other hand, pietas is also understood to mean a conviction to moral values. Put together, pietas is the virtue of the complete soul, fulfilled in its adhesion to the moral sentiments stemming from the individual's sure recognition of his place in the order of things. Furthermore, for the individual, the acquisition of pietas is the result of learning his responsibilities and meeting his responsibilities to his family, his city, his gods, and to all mankind. By grasping pietas through this notion of duty to those entities greater than himself, the individual learns something also of the eternal, universal truths that govern all reality, the truths of goodness, of humanity. This realization of eternal truth resounds in the soul and leaves an imprint of the real good in the individual. He learns to know and honor himself, understands the value of his life, and therein finds both his identity and happiness. So, in the ancient conception, to attain pietas through the education and fulfillment of his duties, the individual comes to the good life. Now, the concept of pietas must undergo slight adjustments for the current age. In order to show how this ancient virtue applies to a modern good life, I focus on 3 attitudes and modes of living: self-reliance, an open mindset, and a guiding purpose. In these aspects, pietas is less driven by subservience to the classical pantheon and the arbitrary classes of humanity, but retains the objective virtues inherent to its conception, those of selflessness, integrity, and temperance, to name a few. Now, to begin to think of living a life of pietas, a person must first attend to his internal matters. He must be self-reliant. I find self-reliance to be a broad term, so I've broken it into 2 major components: acceptance of self and honesty. The first component of self-reliance is acceptance of the self. Acceptance of the self is a mindset of contentedness with oneself and one's abilities, a confidence yet a modesty. Emerson best describes this acceptance of the self in a simile of the roses, saying, "Roses make no reference to former roses or to better ones. They are for what they are. They exist with God today." Like the rose, man must learn to be content with himself. He must learn to make no reference to the past or to better men. This self-acceptance does not mean that the individual should become complacent, however. Indeed, quite the opposite. Emerson is speaking to an evenness of temperament and a sense of serenity and fulfillment. Emerson's roses are able to be for what they are, because as roses, they are already fulfilling their purpose to be roses. However, for humans, this fulfillment is much harder. The real meaning of the rose simile is to become as human as possible, and thus learn to both strive to be better, while concurrently finding harmony within the discordant nature of humanity. Only if an individual finds this peace with himself will he be able, like the rose, to exist with God and take a step towards the good life. Now, the second part of self-reliance is honesty. Honesty is both an honesty of conviction and an honesty of ability. Honesty of conviction simply means that the self-reliant individual maintains a steady pursuit of that which he genuinely believes to be good. While it is good to listen to the opinions of others to some extent, ultimately, the self-reliant individual must rely upon his own judgment. Emerson describes such an individual using the simile of a ship, writing, "The best voyage is a zigzag line of 100 tacks. See the line from a sufficient distance at a little height of thought, and it strains itself to an average tendency." Like the ship on its best voyage, a self-reliant individual has a clear goal: attaining pietas and living the good life. However, along the way, he will be forced by life to choose different journeys and actions that may seem to diverge from the path to his goal, like a ship sailing into crossroads. So, like the ship which tacks in a zigzag line, so too must the man diverge from the direct path and choose those actions which seem best to him. And in the end, the ship's journey, though close seeming to swing with hundreds of juxtaposed turns, shows itself from sufficient height to follow an average tendency. And in the same way, if the man is honest in his convictions and follows what he believes to be right, then even if he contradicts himself at times, he will have straightened and aimed his whole being at his goal in the best way he could have. Now, as much as the self-reliant individual must stay true to those principles within him, he must also honor those around him by doing the best he can in any situation. In possessing this attitude and living in this manner, the self-reliant man thus displays the other side of honesty, honesty of ability. Lou Holtz describes this best in his 2015 commencement speech, saying, "Do everything to the best of your ability with time allotted. Not everybody can be first team. Everybody can be the best you're capable of being. I want to tell you, if you want to fail, you have the right to fail. But you do not have the right to cause other people to fail because you don't do everything to the best of your ability. When you join a spouse, you bring a child into the world, you join a business, you join a team, you have obligations and responsibilities, and you owe it to other people to do the maximum you can at each and everything you do. Even though humans are called to the good, many often fall short at some point. Yet the self-reliant individual is not necessarily he who gets closest to perfection. He is not necessarily the first team of virtue. Rather, the self-reliant individual is he who does everything to the best of his ability, time allotted. He recognizes his fallibility, but nonetheless strives in everything he does for excellence, putting forth his best efforts to improving himself and fulfilling those responsibilities he has to others. Furthermore, by recognizing those obligations and responsibilities, the self-reliant individual thereby grasps the concept of duty and selflessness inherent within Pietas. With self-reliance as a foundation, the individual can proceed to the next aspect of Pietas, the external aspect of an open mindset. As the internal aspect of Pietas is primarily concerned with a person's internal principles and the actions he took to remain true to himself. The external aspect deals with the person's perceptions of those around him, as well as his interactions with and responsibilities to them. The open mindset is a term from David Foster Wallace's 2005 Kenyon commencement speech, in which he describes the open mindset as the proper attitude of humanity. I have separated the open mindset into two distinct divisions: the principle of beneficence and the acceptance of external factors in life. The first component of the open mindset is the principle of beneficence. Beneficence is a term often used in philosophy to describe the concept of promoting the good of others. Tom Bouchon summarizes, the term beneficence connotes acts or personal qualities of mercy, kindness, generosity, and charity. It is suggestive of altruism, love, humanity, and promoting the good of others. The language of a principle or rule of beneficence refers to a normative statement of moral obligation to act for the other's benefit, helping them to further their important and legitimate interests. Beneficence is nothing new to most people. Common morality, Christian morality in the West, dictates to some degree that each person should look to do good to his neighbor. The difference between common morality and the beneficence integral to Pietas is that individuals acting in the system of the common morality perceive and even praise acts of beneficence as supererogatory, going above and beyond the call of duty. However, the principle of beneficence in Pietas calls the individual to act for the good of others as a duty. While acts of extreme beneficence still lie outside the realm of duty, acts such as Sidney Carton's sacrifice for losing the man, failing to act with beneficence in more moderate circumstances, such as holding open a door for people behind you, would signify some deficiency of Pietas, even if common morality would not reflect such deficiency. The other component, the second part of the open mindset, is an acceptance of external factors. This acceptance is different from the acceptance inherent in self-reliance. But the self-reliant acceptance is an acquisition of inner harmony with one's character and various traits. In contrast, the acceptance of the open mindset is an acceptance of those events and actions of other people and other forces that are beyond the individual's control. To possess this acceptance is to grasp one's place in the order of things, one of the key parts to Pietas. Many things occur in life that are beyond any individual's control. Fate, fortune, karma, such are the names for a phenomenal force that inflicts injury and bestows blessings to humans. The acceptance of the open mindset recognizes these injuries and blessings for what they are, beyond the control of humans, and seeks to control the responses to such events. Marcus Aurelius wrote on an attitude of acceptance, describing that the individual must remain composed in the face of fortunes and misfortunes alike. He writes, in sum, life is short. Make your gain from the present moment with right reason and justice. Keep sober and relaxed. Life indeed is short, and with such an attitude in mind, the open-minded person must react to whatever faces him in the present moment with right reason and justice. In other words, the open-minded person reacts to the circumstances that befall him with discipline, discerning a reasonable and just response. For bad circumstances, this reaction may be clear. For example, if a death were to occur of a close friend or family member, the open-minded individual should react with gratitude instead of anger. Of course, grief is perfectly acceptable as long as the grief does not poison the attitude with a sense of entitlement or recklessness. However, for good circumstances, the reaction of the individual must also be carefully disciplined. For example, if a person won the lottery, he should react with gratitude for his fortune as well as a temperance. So, for both the fortunes in life as well as the misfortunes, the open-minded person must seek to react with reason and justice. The last aspect of Pietas is the guiding purpose, an overarching theme that governs both the internal motions of self-reliance and the externally directed motions of the open mindset. Purpose in common parlance tends to connote a notion of greatness, uniformity, and certainty. When most people think of purpose, they tend to think of examples such as Aeneas, whose purpose was to found a new home for his people. This was a great purpose. However, a purpose does not have to be aimed towards some mighty great deed. A purpose may be for something as simple as working a 9-to-5 job in order to put food on the table for one's family. For this thesis, all that is required of a purpose is that it must be moral and it must serve an ideal. A purpose must serve to seek some ideal. However, ideals exist in many forms, and therefore, purposes may vary depending upon what ideal they seek. Ultimately, all ideals are transcendental ideas of excellence. They are the objects that virtues are modeled after, and the truths that virtues derive their own worth from. Classic examples of ideals are the ideals of beauty, truth, or justice. Such ideals are vast, however, and contain many smaller ideals within them. It is important to note that the grandeur of the ideal is not the determining factor of the purpose's work. Serving a modest ideal, such as the man serving his family in his boring 9-to-5 job, carries as much weight as the lawyer serving the ideal of justice, provided that both men use relatively comparable steps in their services. Now, while serving an ideal gives a purpose a higher meaning, it certainly fulfills the person to some degree. For the man of Pietas, such a meaning would be devoid of any worth without the essential element of morality. Morality is the system and values of what is good. It is what puts good in the good life, the spiritual integrity of Pietas. For the ideal of Pietas, this system can take many forms, ranging among the 3 normative philosophies into pluralist territory. No one system is a true morality. Each has its flaws and strengths. Yet, the morality of Pietas contains 2 essential concepts against which the morality of purpose may be judged: the principle of humanity and the concept of an objective good. The first essential concept of morality is Kant's principle of humanity. The principle of humanity is essentially the idea of respecting all beings who possess sentience and autonomy, most prominently, of course, humans. In a way, it is the converse of the principle of beneficence. For under the principle of beneficence, a person is called to act for the benefit of others. Conversely, a person is called to always treat a human being, yourself included, as an end and never as a mere means, under the principle of humanity. Treating others as ends means that one will interact with others with the hope to interact to everyone's benefit. This idea is not entirely incompatible with treating someone as a means, which is to treat someone or deal with someone so that he helps you achieve one of your goals. For example, say a person hires a worker to fix his roof. He or he is using the other person as a means to accomplish his goal. However, if he deals with the worker fairly and pays and is respectful, then he has also treated the worker as an end. In contrast, to use someone as a mere means is to deal with another in a way that fails to respect his distinctively human features. In the same example, if the person looking to hire the worker were to blackmail or extort the worker, then he would be treating him as a mere means. Thus, while the principle of beneficence deals with the intent and goals of a person's actions, the principle of humanity safeguards the motives and methods by which the person carries out their action, or in this case, purpose. The other significant part of the morality of Pietas is the concept of an objective good. Objective moral standards or goods are simply those rules or goods that are correct, independently of our opinion of them. These objective moral truths are the eternal, universal truths that govern all reality, hinted at in Pietas. While not all of the objective goods are concretely known, for Pietas, it is safe to say that such goods as compassion and truth are objectively good, and it is important to recognize that they are good despite what a person may think of them. For even when a person may have to divert from truth by, say, lying to save another person, he must recognize that truth is objectively good, and only in specific circumstances should he violate that principle. Thus, his recognition of the objective good helps guide his purpose on a broad scale, acting as the moral compass of the ship tacking towards its ultimate end. Now, one point of contention against my thesis arises from the idea that the life of Pietas is far too ascetic, as presented by me. For as you may have noted, there seems to be no acknowledgement of enjoyment or leisure. I do touch briefly on a person's duty to develop himself and his talents to the best extent he can within the subject of self-reliance, but I do seem to omit his choice to relaxation or comfort. Furthermore, even the topics of friendship and love are mostly omitted from my thesis. Thus, like many theses championing a selfless approach, I now face the accusation that no one can believe in this thesis because it calls for an abandonment of self-care for the sake of something higher, which is clearly impractical, impossible, and self-defeating. However, in answer to this argument, I propose that even though I may not have explicitly stated a necessity of personal care, it is implicit throughout each part of Pietas. Most prominently, the concept of the principle of humanity enforces self-care. For in the definition of the principle of humanity that I provided lies the phrase, yourself included, to indicate that you should never use any human, including yourself, as a mere means to an end. By always sacrificing your desires, leisure, or personal care, you would be using yourself as a mere means, which would therefore violate the morality of pietas. Thus, even though pietas is an inherently unselfish virtue, it does hold an implicit charge for self-care. Alfred Lord Tennyson remarks that death closes all, yet something near the end, some work of noble note may yet be done. For some of humanity, this may mean great deeds and extraordinary lives. However, for all of us, this work of noble note ought to mean living the good life. And from self-reliance to the open mindset of the guiding purpose, pietas is a timeless virtue that leads us to the good life. For in pietas, no matter our circumstances, we are able to find harmony in ourselves. We are able to grow beyond our own selfish default setting. We are able to attribute our very lives to a higher call. Especially now, as we, not just as families, not just as communities, not even just as nations, but as all humanity, face the COVID-19 pandemic and the economic, political, and social devastation that it has wrought. It is especially important to choose to use our allotted time in pursuit of pietas and the good life. Thank you.
All right, Ryan, very well done. So we will open it up for questions. I'm going to hit return on mine and give you an opportunity to read through it a little long. Encourage other people to type your questions up and get those up there for Ryan. Thank you, Ryan.
Thank you. Okay. Mr. Anderson's question. Oh boy. The doing for ourselves and the doing for others is not always commensurable. Something must give, and so self-abnegation is usually perceived to be good. Most balance a need for self-care can service to others, and while we must care for others to care for others, we must care for ourselves to care for others. The care for self need only be rather limited. What about sacrificing our advancement or accrual of wealth for another's welfare? How do we judge what is needed versus what is supererogatory? Okay. What are the rewards of such actions and lives? Okay, so what about? So sacrifice is yeah, so it's a bit of a difficult thing to perceive in my thesis, because so on the one hand I do claim that Sidney Carton's type of sacrifice is supererogatory because it's giving up so much and no one could be asked to do that. I think that so sacrifice, that's mostly going to lie to the individual's judgment, because so there are clear examples where you should be self-sacrificing. When I'm opening a door, there's no real penalty to me. It's just something good that I can do for others that doesn't have any cost for me. So clearly that's a case in which you should be under the principle of beneficence, sacrificing your duty, or sacrificing your time to help others. However, in broader, once it gets past that point where it's unclear whether there's a real call to sacrifice like your happiness for someone else's, that very much relies upon the individual who would be making the sacrifice and what he judges to be best. And so, for example, with Sidney Carton, his sacrifice to him is something that is certainly duty, but someone not in his shoes and not of his life experience would probably not be expected to make that same sort of sacrifice. So yeah, how do we judge what is necessary? I think one of the simplest tests that you could make is consider what the real like cost would be for you, because a lot of the times there are a lot of things that we can be doing for other people that don't really cost us much more than a little bit of time or a little bit of effort. While we might not want to put in that effort to help other people, it's kind of it is the responsibility of someone seeking pietas to set that time aside or set aside that effort and actually help people. Does that answer your question? Let me scroll down and find out. I have seen It's a Wonderful Life. It's, Jimmy Stewart, right? I only know this because Miranda likes Jimmy Stewart. Ooh. See, yeah, okay. So I think that George Bailey ultimately does not get justified by my thesis entirely, because he ends up sacrificing so much that he uses himself as a mere means. And this is evidenced by the fact that he works himself so hard and gives up everything he's ever wanted just for the sake of helping his family. And while that is noble and it's admirable, it treats himself as a mere means, and therefore it does not really qualify as my good life. Okay, let me scroll back up. Okay, Dr. McMahon. Comes with maturity. You therefore seem to be saying that a youth like you cannot be living the good life because he has not the maturity for self-reliance. Please respond to this. So, like, okay, so while a certain part of self-reliance is a maturity and the Greeks would call it phronesis, practical wisdom, there is a certain element of self-reliance that grows stronger with your own experience. I do believe that it's a process, and you can start that process basically from the time you have a conscious ability to think and rationally judge things. So while I may not have personally as a youth the same experience that someone like you might have, Dr. Mann, I'm still able to enter into that process of becoming self-reliant. And while it may be, maybe that capacity will be increased as I grow older, but it's not barred for me as a youth just because I'm too young. Does that answer your question? Okay. All right. Scrolling. Mrs. Willis. Congratulations, Mrs. Willis. I'm confused on your head. Except the hierarchy. Person. Okay. So I specifically aim to remove the ancient hierarchy of specifically family, city, God, and gods out of the equation, because so in the time of Pietas, when it was the foundational virtue in Rome, it was very much in the time of sort of the city-state culture, and it was also very much a sort of almost like slave to that hierarchy where even if you personally disagreed or you had obligations to your family, you still had to give everything up for, say, the state, and that's what Aeneas does. And I think that, well, that conflict in the ancient hierarchy, when it happens, tends to lead to messy results. The Roman Republic is certainly an example of this. And even within the Aeneid, Aeneas's final act, when he kills Turnus instead of letting him go, is sort of reflective of that conflict. And furthermore, especially as we've evolved into the modern sort of sense of a nation, especially in America, but in other places as well, I do not think that if a country has forsaken its virtues, or if we're thinking of Polybius says that there's an arc, and a country is founded on those principles, and it, at the climax of its arc, it's upholding those virtues, and then it degrades as it loses those virtues. I think that if a country has forsaken those virtues that it's founded on, so if America were to truly forsake the ideal of liberty and trade it for a tyranny, I do not think that, especially like the city, the nation, should come before family in that instance, or even the self. So it's really a lot about intelligent obedience. And then, so when there are conflicting claims, that comes down to self-reliance. You have to determine for yourself where you're going to go. And at the end of the day, as long as you're staying true to those principles inside you, and you're following those actions, then even if you support one person in a conflict but then have to go to the other, that will be reflected, that in the long run will reflect your direct path to Pietas. Does that answer your question? Okay. Yeah, thank you for your time, Mrs. Wills. All right, Mrs. Kiawa. Open mindset when your definition of the term is radically different. All right, yeah, I actually thought about this when I was listening to Lexi's thesis. So the open mindset is, I explained this better in my paper. The open mindset is a term developed by David Foster Wallace, and it's less about accepting. It's less about accepting every view that's around you, and it's more about getting outside the mindset of being self-centered, which is, as Wallace argues, our natural default setting. Because we can't help it. We're naturally in our own heads. So it's very difficult for us to imagine other people and imagine other people's like outlooks. And so the open mindset is getting out of that mindset and having a basic foundation of care and attention for other people, which is, I think, that's what I wanted to get at when I said open mindset. Not necessarily just accepting the views of other people, because I do think that that would conflict with my notion of self-reliance in a way. Does that explain adequately, or what do you like in elaboration? Okay. Okay. Doc McMahon. Yeah, sorry. I'll just kneel down here now. Okay, Mr. Ayers. You say Pietas is better than because it is your duty to do good for others. But in an individualistic society where the individual is the end goal, what is the enforcement of such a system? Athenian culture fell apart when shame was useless during the Great Plague. Yeah. Even the Romans failed to uphold Pietas. Yep. So if a culture that invented Pietas could not protect it, how can a society that seems contrary to Pietas see its merits and uphold? Okay. So if you are asking how, like, our present culture could try and integrate Pietas into common culture, I don't know if I'm saying that that's entirely possible, because while there are sets of people, communities like Ridgeview, who might be able to adapt to that, I think that a lot of the world today is revolving around the individual in the way that Wallace describes again. And so it's my thesis is more targeting the individual and exhorting him to act like this way, even if society around him may not necessarily uphold the same ideals. Does that answer your question? I don't know how you would convince all of society to uphold this pious action, but it's the responsibility of just individuals to try. I'm going to move on, but if you would like an elaboration, please feel free to type it in. Mrs. Holside. Living above time. What do you think he means by that? Does living above time connect us to the eternal transcendent? How can we live that way? Okay. So, it's been a while since I read all of Emerson. When he says that living like the roses is above time, I think he means that, yeah, in a way, living with self-reliance allows us to connect to some very fundamental, or perhaps eternal and transcendent ideas, because we've taken ourselves out of the stream of modern society, and we're connecting back to those foundational principles that I think that most of modern society doesn't really espouse a lot. So in that sense, we'd be living above any time, because it doesn't matter what time period or what culture we're living in, we're still connected to that same moral foundation. And so then, how do we live that way? We live that way simply, well, not simply, by developing self-reliance, and by being able to identify and uphold those principles in our own lives. Does that answer your question? And yes, Mr. Ayers, I am saying that if others don't like that, that's their problem. Okay, Mr. Anderson. Oh no, that's just the follow-up. Mr. Andrew Rutherford. Emphasize two types of honesty, but you do not elaborate specifically on lying versus telling the truth. Must we be honest? Okay. So I do talk about honesty as an honesty of ability and an honesty of conviction, mainly because that pertains to a mode of living, not just simply telling the truth. I think that, so, and then I address the idea of truth as an objective good later on. So what I would say is that we should be honest even in small things, as much as we can. If there are certain circumstances where you might have to tell a lie. I mean, as Dr. McMahon likes to remind me, Immanuel Kant never had a wife, so he never had to deal with the question of whether or not his wife looked fat in a dress. Specific circumstances may call for a violation of objective good. However, ultimately, you should try whenever you can to uphold objective values like truth, and so therefore you should be honest. Does that answer your question? Okay, cool. Daisy. So that's interesting. So the idea that Pietas as a duty is a duty to God is, I do think that's an oversimplification, both in the modern sense and in the ancient conception that I provided. Because ultimately, in the ancient conception, you are supposed to listen to your gods before everyone else, and that is true. But I think that because we're such because we're mortal and because we don't really understand God, there are often times when we won't know what God wants exactly, and then it does fall down to either self-reliance or upholding duties to other people. So then, is duty to God interchangeable with recognition of objective good? In a sense, yes, because I think that someone, if someone is upholding the objective values of what are good, then I'd say religiously, they're still serving God even if they don't necessarily know it or acknowledge it. Because I think, well, as a Christian, objective good is God, in a sense. So it could be interchangeable. I don't know if that answers your question, but please let me know. Okay. Miranda. Okay. Or is it Amanda? What a person should choose, a duty and an ideal. Ah, yeah, okay. Example. Someone who loves his job at nonprofit, but does not make enough. If a duty and an ideal come into conflict. Again, that's going to come down to practical wisdom, and you have to. That's an experiential thing, I think. So, in the example of the Quaker, who is a pacifist by nature or pacifist by religion, but who then serves, who is drafted to serve. So many, so for example, in that case, and I think there's a movie about this, Hacksaw Ridge, where like not pacifists, not Quakers, who didn't want to fight, still were able to serve their country in a different way. And so sometimes when ideals and duties come into conflict, that will be a matter of experience in choosing between them. And sometimes it'll be a matter of experience in trying to figure out how to make them work together. Because hopefully a duty and ideal should not come into direct conflict, or at least there should be a way for them not to. So the Quaker who was drafted can become a medic instead of being a soldier. And I think we have provisions for that. Does that answer your question? Okay. Amanda. Mr. Ayers again. Who decides for culture what piety is? Then what if what is pious for one culture is contrary to the common good of humanity? Ah, okay. That's interesting. See, okay. So if I think I'm understanding your question correctly in that how does someone decide whether like the piety of a culture is good, morally good? And so in answer to that, I would say that you compare your culture's piety to ultimately it will come down to your self-reliance as considered next to your culture's, and so ultimately it is up to the individual to tell whether his culture is contrary to the common good. So I do not think that an evil man can have pietas, even if Mezentius is kind of presented that way in the Aeneid, because ultimately, well, an evil person by nature will be violating the morality of pietas, and I think that at least the morality of what I've presented is pretty objective. So an evil man could not have pietas. Does that answer your question? Okay. TJ. Hey, TJ. which has made honestly, I'm working on all three of them. So I would probably say that self-reliance. No, that's hard. It's a toss-up between self-reliance and the open mindset. I struggle more with the open mindset, but since I've discovered that term, but then also started to try and work on that in my own life, I found that it's really helped me. And I know it may not have reflected in the last week, as my parents have known, because I've been a little short-tempered, but most of the time in my life, having that extra patience and that ability to just pay attention to other people has really enriched my experiences with other people. And so that's how I'd say probably open mindset. The self-reliance is also incredibly important.
All right, Ryan, we're out of time. So we're gonna have to let some of these questions be answered by you in multiple and long emails. Thank you, Ryan, for an excellent presentation, excellent answers to questions. Thanks to everyone who attended. And I think we will hopefully see a lot of you back tomorrow for some more senior thesis presentations, our last ones. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. And yes, Mrs. Hallside, I would like to play soccer. And I'm sad that I got cheated out of it.